evening. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to, I don't have to read this actually. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome an old friend from my days at Oxford, whom I first met in 1993 when he lectured for the job that he was successful in getting at Oxford as the lecturer in Islamic studies from 93 to I think 2006, thereabouts, right? Eight, that's right. It was because of the year I left New York. So I stayed on in Oxford until 96, lost touch with Chase Robinson, who is the president of the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, known as CUNY, by everybody who lives in New York. It's a wonderful institution physically, actually, as well as in terms of its academics, sort of midtown. It is the doctorate granting institution of the nation's largest university. Dr. Robinson, a historian of the pre-modern Middle East, is also a distinguished professor of history at CUNY. And he really is a distinguished professor of history. He did his doctorate on early Umayyad history, early Islamic history, let's say. So, what some of the, just excuse me, I'm sort of halfway between reading and not reading. I'm not going to read at all, actually. He has spent time at the IAS, the Institute for Advanced Studies, which is, of course, the premier institute for research in the United States, I think, and probably in the world. So there he studied what he was, I think he studied with, he was certainly an interlocutor of the great Patricia Croner, another great and unfortunately late professor of Islamic history. She died last year, or this year, in fact, but after a long struggle with cancer, alas. So Chase has written a number of books. If you total what he's edited and what he's written as monographs, I think they total it, aggregate at 6 or 7. Two books I have enjoyed in particular, one on Abd al-Malik, which he produced in the series. He wrote for the series, which was edited by Patricia Croner, in fact, called Makers of the Muslim World. It's a wonderful little book, but significant book, and a great read. On Abd al-Malik, of course, the great, the very significant Umayyad caliph, and he's going to talk to us about the Umayyads tonight. The other book that I like in particular, because I think also it was written, and he has the great merit as a historian and a writer of writing to an audience that's much broader than the sort of small clique of Islamic historians. So he's written a book called Islamic Historiography, which is a fabulous introduction, but a detailed introduction and overview of the different kinds of historiography of the Muslim world within the Muslim world. So without further ado, it's a great honor for me to invite you to welcome Dr. Chase Robinson to the stage. He's going to talk tonight about why the Umayyads matter, and of course we're very pleased that he's going to talk about the Umayyads because we all know that Syria is suffering depredations of a grievous kind, but also the buildings that date back to that period are being destroyed. And so it's good for us to be able to think about the Umayyads and talk about them.
Phil, thank you very much. That's the first time I've ever been introduced to an audience in which the host reminded me that I was once a very nervous applicant for a job. So those of you applying for jobs know that you can underperform but still get the job sometimes. All kidding aside, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to see Phil. We had lost contact, but I'm glad to know that he is prospering. It is a great pleasure to be here in Abu Dhabi as well, and to see with my own eyes the terrific work that's being done. I'm indebted to Phil and to NYU Abu Dhabi for having me. I'm also grateful to you for coming to hear what I have to say about the Umayyads. But allow me to begin by saying a few words that belong to someone else. This is not a former teacher. This is somebody else in a very different time. This is someone named Edward Zachau. The words with which I'm going to begin belong to Zachau. He was a German Orientalist, best known to us for a monumental work on the 11th century polymath El-Biruni. Some of you will know of El-Biruni, just a fantastic, fantastic figure in Islamic learning, indeed global learning. Now, Zachau was an extraordinary figure for many reasons. He was an Arabist, he was a Syriacist, he was a papyrologist in some sense, before papyrology was a proper field. He published seminal works on both Christian and Islamic history and law. And in addition to all that, he became an expert on India through his work on El-Biruni. But as you'll suspect, I am not here to praise El-Biruni. I begin by citing El-Biruni because for all of his limitless erudition, he had a knack for getting things spectacularly wrong. More precisely, Zachau had an almost uncanny ability to capture and express historical truths that once so self-evident that they required virtually no demonstration. These self-evident truths have been shown to be utterly bankrupt. One example is what he says about the 11th century and its purported role in the intellectual history of Islam. The 4th century of the Islamic calendar is the turning point in the history of the spirit of Islam and the establishment of the Orthodox faith. About 500 sealed the fate of independent research forever. But for al-Ash'ari and al-Ghazali, the Arabs might have been a nation of Galileos, Keplers, and Newtons. This is a wonderful citation. If you Google it, you'll find lots of results. Lots of people cite it. It's complete rubbish. Lots of things could be said about what he wrote, and again, I'm being slightly unfair. He wrote these words in 1888. Lots of things could be said about these words, quite apart from the most obvious, this business about the spirit of Islam or the question of orthodoxy. The point that I'd like to make here, however, is that this turning point idea is now demonstrably false. In fact, your own Justin Stearns and I were talking about this earlier today. As anyone who knows the intellectual history of Islam in the 12th, or the 13th, or the 14th, indeed through the 17th or 18th century will know, there has been a generation, more than a generation now, of work that demonstrates how vital Islamic philosophy was well after the 11th and the 12th century, logic, many of the sciences, especially astronomy. Now, I won't go into more details than that because that would constitute the beginning of a lecture on the 11th century. And I meant to be talking about the 7th and 8th. But Zachau, not surprisingly, had a few things to say about the Umayyads. The court of the caliphs of the house of Umayyad at Damascus does not seem to have been a home for literature. Except for the practical necessities of administration, they had no desire for the civilization of Greece, Egypt, or Persia, their thoughts being engrossed by war and politics and the amassing of wealth. Probably they had a certain predilection for poetry, common to all Arabs. But they did not think of encouraging historiography, much to their own disadvantage. In many ways, these Arab princes only recently emerged from the rocky wilderness of the Hejaz and suddenly raised to imperial power, retained much of the great Bedouin sheikh of the desert. He continues, the cradle of Arabic literature is not Damascus, but Baghdad, and the protection necessary for its rise and growth was afforded by the caliphs of the house of Abbas, that is to say, the Abbasids, whose Arab nature had been mollified, that's his word, by the influence of Iranian civilization during a long stay in Khorasan, that is to say, eastern Iran. Why the Umayyads matter? Well, grammatically that's a declarative sentence, a proposition, but of course it's very close to a question. Do the Umayyads matter? That's an alternative title that in fact I had put to Phil, and I think he was quite right in steering me away from the question and towards the proposition. So in the time I have today, I will do my best to vindicate Phil's guidance. Now, while we're rolling down the runway here and getting ready for takeoff, just as when we see it in airplanes, we look up and are instructed to examine the video. In this case, it will not be for the sake of safety, but for the sake of some orientation. First, a genealogical chart, which I hope you can read. It shows the two branches of the Umayyads, the Marwanids on the left and the Sufyanids on the right. The Umayyads began to rule according to the conventional periodization in 660, and they were overthrown by the Abbasids in 750. So that's the chart. The next slide is simply a list of the Umayyads. The slide says the Umayyads in Syria because, of course, there was a successor dynasty, the Umayyads of Spain. We know much more about them. That list of Umayyads in Syria, just draw your attention to Muawiyah, the great governor of Syria who became caliph. I'll be saying a few words about Muawiyah. I will, and it'll come as no surprise to you now, given Phil's generous introduction. I'll be saying more about Abdul Malik, but I'll also mention Al-Walid and Hisham and even Marwan II. Al-Humar, as he's called in Arabic literature. The last is just a map that shows the Islamic world in 750. Of course, it is under the Umayyads, and this is a point that I could have made in the body of my lecture, but I like to think I've said more interesting things in my lecture. It's under the Umayyads that the Islamic realms got to their largest extent as a centralized single state. Because as soon as the Abbasid revolution took place, in fact, a few years before, 749, 750, Spain and soon much of North Africa broke off from the Islamic world. So it was Muslim Spain, but it was no longer under the rule of caliphs from Damascus or Iraq. So there's just a little bit of orientation. I'm going to organize my comments in three sections. First, I'm going to say a few words about history, or more precisely, early Islamic history, and its increasing salience. Because history writing and history lecturing and thinking about history is, at some level, always a political act. Second, I'll argue against myself initially. I'll lay out some of the evidence for Umayyad failure, for there is no getting around it, relative not just to the Abbasids, as we'll see, the Abbasids who succeeded the Umayyads as caliphs, but even relative to any number of other Muslim dynasties. The Umayyad rule was nasty, it was short, and it was brutish. Finally, and third, I will show that the Umayyads mattered, or I'll try to discuss some of the ways in which how they mattered was interesting. And I'll try to do that by focusing mainly on their efforts, in the end, too little, too late, to generate a religio-political culture. And here is the one sentence, as it were, or one of the small handful of sentences that are emphatically and unapologetically academic, a culture that would translate their tribal and military power into legitimating authority. They failed, but they tried. That's the bit that Sakha didn't understand. So first, some comments about history and its relevance. Now, when I began my PhD in the middle of the 1880s, it feels that way sometimes, the 1980s, early Islamic history was it was a sleepy field. It was a field where scholarship moved very slowly, answering academic questions that it, for the most part, put to itself, negotiating around such controversy as existed. It might be said that in those days we were archaeologists working on the World Heritage Site that was the pre-modern Middle East, a pre-modern Middle East that happened to be Islamic. I say that because in those days, the arc of Middle Eastern history was thought to bend towards secularization and nationalism, and to measure how religion occupied not just the moral universe of the individual, but also the world of politics. Well, that was to ask questions about a world we then thought that had ceased to be. The world in the middle of the 1980s was changing around us, we scholars, but the field, highly specialized, had not really noticed, at least not initially. The Iranian Revolution took place in 1979, closely followed by Anwar Sadat's assassination at the hands of Islamists who accused him of abandoning Islam. By the mid-1980s, Muslim militiamen, whom we now know as Taliban, were resisting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Hezbollah soldiers were resisting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Hezbollah soldiers were fighting against Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon. And the Iran-Iraq War, which pitched Islamic revolution against a Ba'athist secular order, was at its bloodiest. The return of Islam, as Bernard Lewis put it in 1976, would mean a return of Islamic history as what we might call a discursive frame, a way of seeing the past. The past is never dead. It's not even past, as William Faulkner put it in Requiem for a Nun. Most any discussion of the American present, about gross disparities of income and inequality, about unequal access to education, healthcare, or housing, about violence, about crime, guns, these are framed sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, by the American past. An American past created by us in the present, a legacy of freedom, of opportunity, of democracy, but also, as you will all know, a legacy of violence, of racism, of frontier individualism, and capitalist excess. How we envision the present and future is inevitably conditioned by the past that we create for ourselves. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning, is how T.S. Eliot begins part 5 of Little Gidding, the last of his 4 quartets. We are born with the dead. See, they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments. So, while the light fails on a winter's afternoon, in a secluded chapel, history is now and England. One of my favorites. It's not so different here. History lectured Anwar al-Awlaqi, the American Yemeni jihadist who was killed by a drone in September of 2011, was Muslims, and here I quote, umbilical cord, our lifeline. We are not severed from our roots. We are part of a glorious ummah that we need to study. The life of Muhammad, he continued, was the most important ingredient in our history. What we have in al-Awlaqi's lectures is a jihadist iteration, and this is a bit of a mouthful, bear with me. It's a jihadist iteration of a modernist proposition. Itself, this proposition is grounded in the pre-modern soil of Islamic traditionism. What do I mean by that? The proposition is the first generation of Muslims was paradigmatic. First generations of Muslims were a source not merely for the law, but for normative conduct more generally, and also a model, at least in his view, for social organization. Now, as we know, for Awlaqi and his ilk, it's jihad that sits at the heart of that paradigm, and so his religion. But there are other, altogether more attractive constructions of both religion and Islam, and those are grounded in history too. Take Abdullah Ahmed al-Naim, a leading progressive who argues for a privatized Islam, an Islam which makes no claims upon the polity. In fact, he argues that his model for a secular state, modeled in his view upon Muhammad's career in Mecca, is, in his words, quote, more consistent with Islamic history than the so-called Islamic state model. Or take, for a very different example, those who champion rationalism and reason, critical readings of scripture, for example, the championing of science. Many of these, although certainly not all, are self-styled neo-Mu'tazilites. They argue that the legacy of Islam lies in the cosmopolitanism, in the multiculturalism, that culture of reason that to them characterized not the prophetic period, but the early Abbasid period, al-Ma'mun. Now, I'm sure you've anticipated my point. In part, the battle for what constitutes Islam is a battle over Islamic history. Normative judgments about the present being found in paradigms that purportedly date from the past. And here's the point that I'd like to emphasize here. The Umayyads are squeezed out of this battle for paradigmatic authority. It's not that the Umayyads were written out of the narrative of early Islamic history. Far from it. Anyone who's read Islamic historiography will know that they have indeed a very prominent role. Sometimes they are even grudgingly acknowledged as capable, though certainly not exemplary. Much more often, though, they're criticized as self-indulgent, as dissolute, even tyrannical. Now here's a map of the Umayyad residences in current-day Syria, Palestine, and Jordan. These used to be called the desert palaces, but that generic term has now fallen into happy obsolescence because, in fact, many of them were not in the desert. Qusayr Amra is in Jordan. Those of you who have been there will have been impressed. It is a remarkable place. Echoing its reputation in the historical literature, UNESCO calls it a small pleasure palace. Khirbat al-Mafjar, also known as Qasr Hisham, is now located near Jericho, Riha. A pleasure palace, summer residence where the caliphs indulged their appetite for music, for wine, and for women. Turning away from the material evidence towards popular religious culture and historical narrative, the picture is no more impressive. Hedonism gives way to tyranny. Now, nearly all Umayyad history is narrated by those who were hostile to the Umayyads. In this respect, Zaho is not so much right, but it remains the case that little Umayyad history survives. And so we're very much operating at the mercy of, for the most part, Abbasid historians who had a stake in legitimizing the dynasty that had overthrown the Umayyads, and who in any case really didn't know much about 7th and 8th century Syria. They were living in 9th and 10th century in Iraq for the most part. So as I was saying, nearly all Umayyad history is narrated by those who are hostile to it. Late and opportunistic converts to Islam, the Umayyads were generally considered mere kings, not legitimate caliphs, such as the Abbasids, who were born to the Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet. In fact, there is a veritable demonizing of the Umayyads in some of the literature, particularly in the sectarian literature, and especially in Shiite literature. In terms of popular culture, if it's given its most vivid theatrical illustration in Ta'ziyeh, which recounts the agonizing death of Hussein. Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib, whom, as many of you know, was the cousin and the son-in-law of the Prophet. Yazid ibn Muawiyah ruled from 680 to 683, Muawiyah's son. He's given to exemplify Umayyad impiety and brutality. It is Yazid we read in histories or watch in videos such as these stills are drawn from. It is Yazid who pokes with his walking stick the mouth of Hussein ibn Ali's severed head, the very mouth that the Prophet himself had kissed. Hussein was considered by the Shiites for sure the favorite grandson of Muhammad. The Umayyads received some pretty bad press, as it will become clear. Abdul Malik ordered the construction of the Dome of the Rock, probably in 688 or 689, we're not sure. The building itself was completed in 692 or 693, again, we're not sure. We're not sure because the sources don't tell us so. As you can see, the building sits atop the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And it's often interpreted as a monument to victory. The Umayyads' victory over Abdullah ibn Zubayr. You recall from that first genealogical chart, on your left was the Marwanids, on your right the Sufyanids. What separates the Sufyanid branch of the dynasty from the Marwanid that succeeded was the Second Civil War, especially the role of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Now, depending on your view of things, Ibn al-Zubayr was either an anti-caliph, that is to say a counter-caliph who claimed to rule and lived and ruled from Mecca and the Hijaz, or, as I've argued, he was a caliph who was written out of Islamic history. Now, the exterior of the Dome of the Rock has been modified over time, but much less so the interior, especially the mosaics which illustrate the transitional character of the decorative tradition of the 7th century, which, as you can see, or as you can imagine, those of you who are familiar with Byzantine architecture and visual culture, it owes a great deal indeed to Byzantine traditions. The same point, or certainly a similar point, can be illustrated in the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, which had its origins in the cathedral of the city. The transformation of cathedral into mosque was affected by the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid, who was one of the sons of Abdul Malik, who succeeded his father, and Walid ruled from 705 to 715. What we have in this material evidence is a witness to a broader cultural transformation that was affected as a result of direct and indirect Umayyad patronage. I will flesh that proposition out. But for now, the point I'm emphasizing is this: the historical tradition gives little or no credit to the Umayyads. For example, long accounts narrate the destruction that was caused in Mecca as Umayyad armies, at that point fighting the armies of Ibn Zubayr, bombarded the town, and they caused a great deal of damage to the Kaaba itself. So much damage to the Kaaba that Abdul Malik had to rebuild parts of it. So they preserve long accounts, gruesome accounts, shocking accounts of that destruction in Mecca. But about the building of the Dome of the Rock, they say virtually nothing. It's precisely because they're relatively quiet that we have to infer its date from an inscription which survives as part of the building. When it comes to the Umayyads, indifference and hostility are thus the rule. Now, I wouldn't be an academic unless I qualified such a gross generalization. There are several qualifications that need to be made, exceptions to the rule of Umayyad hedonism, impiety, and brutality. One is what rightly has been called a cult of Muawiyah. A cult of Muawiyah attested nearly throughout the pre-modern period traditions and monographs that compiled his merits and his virtues, especially a clemency and forbearance, hilm, that made him an effective ruler. Another exception is the reputation earned by Umar II, who reigned from 717 to 720. Umar II was a nephew of Abd al-Malik. Umar II is sometimes called the fifth of the rightly guided caliphs. We're all familiar with the four. Sometimes he is reckoned the fifth. Alone among the Umayyads, he was considered pious and just, and so a model for conduct and for the law. Third exception, quite different, which is why I mentioned it here, interesting I think, is the portrayal of the Umayyads very positively as Arab nationalists avant la lettre. This was a view of many early and mid-20th century Arab intellectuals operating in an ideological world in which the Arabizing policies of Muawiyah, of Abd al-Malik and Hisham, and I'll get to those Arabizing policies in a moment, those prefigured Nasr and the like. Now, this particular construction of the Umayyads as proto-nationalists, it no longer has much cultural purchase, I think for obvious reasons, the rise of Islamic politics. So an obvious question is this: are the Umayyads getting the press that they deserve? The point is yes and no, as you probably have sensed already. I'll begin with the no. And here I've reached the second part of my presentation. I'll be arguing against myself a little bit. The martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala forms but one episode, albeit a major one, in a broader mythology of oppression and injustice, the Umayyads being understood as the first proto-Sunni oppressors of the Shiites. But whereas Shiism produced polity after polity, especially in its Ismaili and Zaydi varieties, the Umayyads, it must be conceded, were a failure. As many of you will know, and I've already stated, Umayyad rule was short-lived, a mere 90 years, short-lived especially relative to the 500 years or so that the Abbasid ruled. Now this is a facile comparison between Umayyad brevity and Abbasid longevity, but I think it actually embeds something fairly interesting. It can reasonably be said that the Umayyads failed to generate a viable political culture. By that I mean a narrative, particularly a narrative of origins, or a set of governing traditions. They had some, but certainly they were not robust. Or a compact, a set of agreements, implicit, explicit, with non-Umayyad elites, be they landed or military. They did not generate that political culture, one that could buffer them from their instincts. And it must be said their instincts were more tribal than imperial. In the absence of legitimating language, effective governing institutions, and that compact, the Umayyad dynasty was not only considered brutal and impious, but even worse than that, the Umayyads were dispensable. So the comparison with the Abbasids is instructive. Abbasid political culture was subject to all manner of change and transformation during the 8th, during the 9th, and the 10th centuries. But what was scarcely challenged was the Abbasid dynasty's monopoly on the office of the caliphate. The civil wars of the early and mid-9th century were violent and disruptive. Baghdad was besieged, flooded, burned. Caliphs were murdered. Even so, power remained in the Abbasid family, the conflicting claimants always coming from the Abbasid patrilineal line. By contrast, when the civil war broke out in the 740s, a civil war that put paid to Umayyad brutality, there was no give in the state or in the dynasty. Nothing illustrates this more vividly this, their abject failure, than the events of 749-750, when that state collapsed. What happened in 749-750? Once Abbasid armies coming from the east had defeated Umayyad armies, first in Iran and Iraq, and then finally in Syria, there were a series of massacres. There were massacres of both Umayyads and Umayyad loyalists in northern and central Syria, in Damascus, in Palestine, in central, southern, and northern Iraq, and in Egypt. Sometimes hundreds and even thousands were killed. One by one, members of the Umayyad clan were hunted down and murdered, including several minors. Not only that, some of those already long dead, and here I apologize for the indelicate description, some of those already long dead were disinterred and their remains lashed and immolated. I've argued elsewhere that this violence was nothing short of theatrical, a kind of public performance of retribution. Now, part of what explains this gross violence was Shiite revenge, especially in Iraq and parts of Khorasan, kind of eerily prefiguring what's going on in some parts of the world right now. But not all of it. The distaste was widespread. And this explains why virtually no one came to the aid of the poor and pathetic Marwan II, the last Umayyad caliph, who, outside of Syria, saw no support at all. Indeed, outside of Syria, there was not even a whiff of counter-revolution. Little wonder, I think, Umayyad armies, especially in Iraq and Iran, had been perceived more or less as occupiers, and brutal ones as that. Umayyad policies, with a handful of exceptions, were not only repressive, but positively reactionary. The clearest example of this comes in their policies occasioned by immigration from the countryside to the cities. Converted or converting non-Arabs sought to gain entrance into Islamic society by entering cities, and the Umayyad answer was very much a kind of anti-immigration line. The Umayyad answer, up until the 740s, when it changed, but it changed too late, was to force those converted or converting peasants back to the land, keeping them outside of the cities. So what I've argued so far is this: the end of Umayyad dynastic power can be explained, at least in part, by adducing a more fundamental failure to generate a polity and a politics that could sustain Umayyad rule. What gives this tautological sounding conclusion some teeth, at least I hope, is the fact that the Umayyads certainly tried. Contrary to earlier scholarship, it's not for lack of effort that the Umayyads failed to generate that polity or that set of political practices. So we can return to Zaha. And here I enter the final and third section of my presentation. I won't reread the passage. We certainly know that the facts are different from how Zaha presented them. In the soil of Umayyad Syria, and Umayyad patronage more generally, did take root a discernibly Islamic culture. Now, this case can be made in part by correcting the great Orientalists. In prose, for instance, Abdul Hamid, who died in 750, Abdul Hamid was now commonly understood. Many of you will know this. Anyone who's a student of Arabic literature. Abdul Hamid is now widely understood as a trailblazer in early Arabic prose. He was patronized by two Umayyad caliphs, by Hisham and by Marwan II. In fact, in Abdul Hamid's letters, which survive in part, were allowed the first glimpses of a legitimating program, a program that presented the caliphs, the Umayyad caliphs in particular, as heirs of prophetic authority, the upholders of his sunnah. Ibn Muqaffa was born in 720 and died 759, of course, famous as a partisan of the Abbasids. He followed his father in serving the Umayyad administration. There's no direct evidence that he received the kind of patronage that Abdul Hamid did, but he was a function, a creature of an administration that was taking root in Umayyad Iraq. The case is very strong in historiography, again, despite what Zaha said. The foundation for prophetic biography, Sirah, it was more or less poured by Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, who died in 741 or 742. Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri was closely attached to the court of the Umayyad Caliph Hisham. Just to remind you, he reigned from 724 to 743. It was a Zuhri, perhaps more than any other single early Muslim historian, who transformed a loose written tradition into the beginnings of a disciplined, a loose oral tradition into the beginnings of a disciplined written tradition, again, especially in Sirah. You'll recall also Zaha's unfortunate words about Islamic philosophy and the heritage of Greece and Athens. The translation movement, of course, it came to full flower in the late 8th and the 9th century. But the Umayyad soil was not nearly as rocky as he would have had it. Pseudo-Aristotelian correspondence to Alexander the Great was being translated into Arabic by Salim Abu al-Ala, who served as secretary, again, in the time of Hisham ibn Abdul Malik. In some, Umayyad courts, at least from the 720s on, were not just incipient centers of Arabo-Islamic learning that featured varieties of prose in addition to poetry, but provisional attempts to outfit Umayyad power with cultural capital. That's precisely what Zuhri, it's precisely what Abdul Hamid were doing. Now, to see the scale of this Umayyad project, one certainly needs to do more than to criticize or correct Edward Zaha. Now, I could cover lots of ground here, but I don't have much time, so I won't. Much could be said about the Arabization of the bureaucracy, by which I mean the conversion of the taxation systems which had used Greek and Persian. Abdul Malik, or perhaps al-Wadid, some combination of the two, got the process started whereby Greek and Persian documents, tax documents, were translated into Arabic, and the system itself was run by Arabs. What this amounts to is the naturalization of formerly Byzantine and Sasanian administrative structures into what amounted to as an Arabo-Islamic idiom. What I'd like to do in the time I have left is to emphasize this Umayyad project of translating tribal and military power into politico-religious authority. The Umayyads were secular rulers. One still reads that to this day. It is absurd. So let me make the case by speaking very briefly about the Quran, about Muhammad, and about caliphate. Each of these, and I'd like to emphasize this, each of these constitutes a problem for historians, those of us doing early Islamic history. Each, the origins of the Quran, the nature of Muhammad's representation, the character of the caliphate, each of these is a problem because doctrine or received wisdom is one thing, but critical history, that is to say history corroborated and interrogated properly, is something else. So first, the Quran. Quranic studies is a fast-moving field. When I was a student, and some of you may have a hard time believing this, the absence of any datable Quran leaves, especially in the context of a rising tide of hyper-skeptical approaches, it led to the speculation that the Quran was much slower in crystallizing than the Islamic tradition traditionally describes it. As many of you know, the common view is that the definitive version of the Quran was executed at the command of the Caliph Uthman, the first Umayyad in some sense. Now, recent research on the Quran is now demonstrating that this revision went altogether too far. scholarship is settling on the view that the text coalesced very quickly, at least relative to other monotheist scriptures, which typically took many decades, in some cases even centuries, to crystallize. The result, and I hope some of you will find this interesting, the result was a text that was obscure already to many 8th century Muslims. It, in other words, had frozen a text which so faithfully captured the Sitz im Leben, the setting of the early 7th century, that in lexicon, to some extent in grammar, it was opaque. Now, precisely when the text became definitive remains an open question, in part because radiocarbon dating, which is being used to date Quran leaves, is problematic. But late 7th century and early 8th century results are now fairly common. In fact, one of the results for the Birmingham Quran was that it predates Muhammad himself. A problem which is not hard to solve, but that shows you how early some of these Quran leaves are now being dated. What's the point? The point is this. Such work is now clearly demonstrating that the Umayyad period is one of intense experimentation in Arabic script and presentation, such that one can now begin to speak of an Umayyad Quran book culture. Second, Muhammad. It's a closely rated example, and it concerns the presentation of Muhammad as a public, as a legitimizing symbol. Now, as much as some of you may have been interested to know that the Quran didn't come together until the 9th or 10th century, at least according to a now obsolete scholarly view, the very existence of Muhammad was once thrown into doubt for lack of contemporaneous evidence. This view that Muhammad actually didn't exist, that he's kind of a mythical figure, has now been thoroughly discredited for a variety of reasons, one of which is that, in fact, there are contemporaneous non-Islamic sources, written in Syriac, for instance, that unambiguously speak of a prophet named Muhammad operating in Arabia. So that's one question. But a different question, related, in many respects more interesting, is when does Muhammad become a public figure, as it were? A name invoked to support a state or dynastic project. The answer to that has now become clear in the last 20, 25 years. The answer is that Muhammad first appears in a securely dated Muslim artifact in the year 66, which corresponds to the year 686 or 687. That is a silver coin issued in the Iranian city of Bishapur, and if you can make out, those of you who can read Arabic, in the left lower corner, Muhammad Rasulullah. That itself is obviously not a portrait of Muhammad. That's a portrait of either Khosrow II of Yazd or Yazdegerd, I can't recall. That is to say, a Sasanian Shah. That's one of many, many examples of transitional coinage. It mixes Arabic script with Sasanian motifs. And this coin, as I said, minted in 66 or 686, is the first time we have material evidence for Muhammad's name. Thereafter, and this is important things, during the 680s, later 680s, 690s, 700s, his name is invoked and recorded in a wide variety of media, in inscriptions and other coins, a variety of different media. Third and a last example, the caliphate, by which I mean a particular conception that the caliph represents God on earth. This conception emerges in full bloom in poetry, in prose, and visual culture. During the reign of Abdul Malik, it would survive until the middle of the 9th century. So allow me to make this point by taking a look at another coin. And this is a portrait of Abdul Malik. In fact, this is the first portrait of early Islam. There is no earlier representation of a Muslim. So there he is. He's bearded. He has a prominent nose, parted and shoulder-length hair. I think you can see it well enough. He's wearing a headdress. He's got a long brocaded robe, covers all of him except for his feet. His mouth is closed, and that's important. At least it's important to me, because it means we cannot confirm the presence of bridge work, which was apparently so poorly executed that he was infamous for his halitosis, for his bad breath. His breath was so bad he was known as the fly killer. When flies would fly by his open mouth, they would drop dead. Now, more seriously, the bulging eyes make a menacing look. Excuse me, that's my telling me I'm out of town. The bulging eyes make that menacing look, which is an impression that is deepened by his pose. He's grasping the pommel of his sword with his right hand. We can't tell if he's sheathing the sword or if he's withdrawing it from the scabbard. Behind his right bent elbow, you can make out a whip, which would have attached to his waistband. Now, given that the earliest issues of coin dates from 693, the earliest issue is 693 of this coin, it's tempting to see in this image an allusion to Abdul Malik's victory in the long and bloody civil war of 685-692. Since the written descriptions of Abdul Malik's appearance make specific mention of the large eyes and long hair, actually we can be fairly confident that the portrait is something like a genuine attempt to capture his likeness. But that's not my main interest here. It's this. More than this crude realism, the point is that this is portraiture as propaganda. What the portrait is telling us is that yours is a warrior caliph. And this assertion of Abdul Malik as a warrior caliph is part of a broader and more enduring project to say something about the caliphate. We know from a variety of sources that the caliph sought to project himself not only in that image of a warrior, but also as a generous patron, a shade or a rain cloud who rained his generosity upon believers, and also a lodestar, one who guided Muslims to right belief. As Al-Akhtal, a contemporary poet, put it, "To a man whose gifts do not elude us, whom God has made victorious, so let him in his victory long delight. He who wades deep into the deep of battle, auspicious his augury, the Caliph of God, through whom men pray for rain." The Caliph, according to this conception, is God's vicegerent on earth, the embodiment of the eternal compact that binds man to God through God's mercy. Abdul Malik asserted so much authority, legal authority, moral authority, that one of his governors mischievously suggested that Muslims should circumambulate around his palace rather than the Kaaba. So I'll move towards a very brief conclusion. One would not know it from the Umayyad legacy and what became the standard narrative of Islamic history, but the Umayyad period was actually one of intense adaptation and experimentation. Late antique traditions of visual culture, of bureaucracy and administration, and also of religious and political thought, these were fused at a very high temperature that was fired by a century-long crisis of legitimacy, fused with Arabian analogues. The ovens, if I may push the metaphor much too far, were Umayyad courts and military settlements that were evolving into towns and cities. Now, some of these experiments were abandoned, and others, such as the caliphate, had a longer life. As I said, this conception, in its essence, survived about a century, century and a half, depending on one's view of early Abbasid history. Some were genuinely enduring, however. So I close with two examples. And the two examples I've chosen because they transcend courts and courtly audiences, and they can illustrate this final point of an enduring legacy. So, this coin in front of you, as you can see, is called a post-reform, all-epigraphic, or anaconic coin. It sheds the figural imagery that we saw in the earlier coin, the standing caliph. It uses Arabic as a decorative theme. The earliest examples belong to 696, 697, later on in the reign of Abdul-Malik, and of course, as you will know, coins were struck in a similar style, anaconic, with no figural imagery, script doing the work throughout Islamic history. Second example, what art historians call the hypostyle mosque, a rectangular building that encloses a courtyard and features a covered prayer hall. The earliest archaeological evidence for this, what became the normative form of the mosque, the earliest archaeological evidence comes from the town of Wasit in south-central Iraq, and it belongs to the first decade of the 8th century, that is to say, the middle of the Umayyad period. Established by the Umayyads, these two great cultural forms are not merely distinctive in their late antique context, they were enduringly distinctive. Throughout Islamic history, coins have been minted on the style, just as mosques have been built on this design. Thank you very much.
I have just building up on the comments that you've done, is it possible that the Umayyad period was a transition of adjustment? And if you look at the map of the expansion of the Islamic rule, you can see that at the turn of the fourth caliph to the Umayyad period, to the Abbasid period, there was little expansion beyond the initial burst. And is it possible that it just took some time to adjust to all these new ethnic groups, new economical models, setting up bureaucracy and so on, and the Umayyad themselves were just part of that experiment because they could not adjust fully, and the inherent weaknesses that were there just came to bite them, and the Abbasid took advantage of that?
I think that's it's a very fair reading. I think, for obvious reasons, I didn't want to spend too much time diagnosing the flaws of the Umayyad project, but arguably the most important one is precisely their failure to come to terms with the fact that the caliphs now ruled this huge, ethnically, linguistically heterogeneous arc of Eurasia, and that they held a bit stubbornly to an Arabo-centric conception of membership in the Islamic community, in the Ummah. In other words, this line of argument would hold. It fell to the Abbasids, by which I mean less, as it were, the branch of the Quraysh living at that time in southern Jordan, as the armies that came from the Islamic East, non-Arabs, particularly from Iran, Khorasan, and to a lesser extent Iraq. It fell to them, as it were, to fulfill that universal opportunity that came with the conquest movements and rule over lands in which Arabs were a very small minority. So so to put it uncharitably, the Umayyads, it could be argued, had a narrow conception of what membership in the Ummah, how it should be constituted. And the early Abbasid had a much more Catholic and broad one, and theirs was victorious, such that the Umayyad policies of resisting conversion were abandoned.
Thanks a lot for a very uplifting presentation. I must say it's actually pretty nice hearing somebody who pronounces the Arabic names correctly. I have two small questions. I think the Umayyad Empire was one of the largest in terms of landmass. I think it's the fifth largest in world history. What were the factors that actually contributed to that, and why weren't any other Islamic empire able to achieve that? And the other question is, was the Andalusian Empire considered Umayyad? Would it be safe to assume that it was Umayyad or not? I always thought it was, and if it was, then it would add 770 years to the Umayyad dynasty, but
Right.
the numbers aren't there. You only said it was 90, so
Right.
thanks.
The second question is almost of a semantic character. I think it's safe to say that the Umayyad refugee, in whose name a dynasty was created in Al-Andalus, bears such a kind of indirect relationship in terms of governing styles, such that I don't think I would concede that the Umayyads carry on in Spain. I would regard that as a separate political project. In fact, I would argue, and have argued, that in many respects the Sufyanid period and the Marwanid period are so radically different that even positing a continuous Umayyad dynasty from 660 to 750 is problematic, rather than from, say, 685 or 692 to 750. Your first question, utterly impossible to do justice to in an answer. The short answer would be this. It was the genius of the Umayyads, one might say. And in this, I think, in many respects, they were vindicated by Islamic history in the 10th and 11th century. It was the genius of the Umayyads to have a relatively light hand ruling. That might sound surprising given what I've said about the reputation for brutality. But relative to early Abbasid governance and taxation, which was really dense, and there are accounts of Syria and Egypt, Iraq and Iran in the 760s, 770s, 780s, 790s, which show a state making claims upon its subjects that had never been claimed before, to the extent that that non-Muslims writing in northern Syria and northern Iraq said, we've never seen these Muslims before. They're acting as if the conquests are first taking place, because the Abbasid tax machine was so ambitious, so extortionary, so thorough. The Umayyads, by contrast, they did themselves no favor in terms of publicity, but they had an altogether lighter hand, with one or two exceptions, and they very much ruled through elites, through indigenous elites, who, as it were, negotiated the contact between imperial power, or Damascus power, and local politics. The Abbasids didn't really, perhaps because of, well, this takes me somewhere else, but for whatever reason, the Abbasids didn't have the good wisdom to follow that tradition of Umayyad governance. And when I say that the Umayyad view was vindicated, well, the Abbasid Empire as a uniform empire only lasted about 150 years, and then the Islamic world broke apart into regional polities.
I think there is contradiction between art of history and the history you're saying about the Umayyad, because as you were saying, Umayyad, you don't think that Andalusia was a part of the Umayyad period, but in art, we see the continuation and even the workers and even the colors, how it reaches from Damascus to Andalusia, and even the decoration. A lot of handicraft moved with the armies from Damascus towards Andalusia. So this contradicts exactly what you were saying, and I think it is in the same period as the Umayyad.
It's always the case that dynastic change does not, or generally does not, occasion deeper disruptions in technology, in production, in trade. So just as it's the case that there was continuity in administration and administrative practices between the Umayyads and the Abbasids, there was continuity between the Byzantines and the Sasanians and the early Umayyads. So if you're arguing that the Umayyad state survived the collapse in the East, survived the collapse of the Umayyad state in the East, and survived in the West, in Spain, I would probably have a number of questions I would put to you. It has to be recalled, for instance, in just one point, the Islamic West fell into civil war in the early 740s. The state that was built in the late 760s and 770s was built upon an army that was utterly different from the Umayyad army, which was the backbone of the Umayyad Caliphate itself. But you're perfectly right that there are continuities in the art historical tradition, just as there are continuities in the administrative and the economic history of the Caliphate.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I just have a question. Do you think if the change from the Umayyads to Abbasids, that it didn't happen and they happened to survive, the progression towards the Golden Age would have never happened, or do you think it's something totally independent?
So Golden Age being the early Abbasid period. So I suppose on this, I'd probably, just to give a lucid answer to your question, I would style myself a kind of geographical determinist. And I would say, as long as the Umayyads, as long as rulers remain committed to Syria and Palestine, and I know I'm saying this in the face of some art historical tradition that shows the influence of Iraqi Sasanian traditions into Syria, just setting that aside, the geographical determinist would say it was determinant that the Abbasids ruled from the former Sasanian capital, or for all intents and purposes, constituted Abbasid rule after ruling initially in the 750s from southern Iraq in 762, 763, establishing Baghdad, and thus put themselves, as it were, in the main artery of Iraqi Iranian culture, the thick culture of Iran. And here I'm probably echoing Dimitri Gutas, that put them into contact with a legacy from the Sasanian and classical learning in a way that the Umayyads had not had the contact that ruling from Syria. That would be a very severe geographic determinism.
I'm going to arrogate to myself the right to ask the last question. You can make it the answer short. It was interesting that you put Ibn al-Muqaffa there when you had the list of the figures who were literary figures who were important in the Umayyad period, and then you mentioned, of course, he was a sort of mukhadram, right? Because he worked for both the Umayyads and the Abbasids. Now, the Ahkam al-Sultaniyya were written by him, right? Who did he write them for? No, well, I got that completely wrong. Is it Abdul Hamid?
Ahkam al-Sultaniyya? Unless there's another text, that's Mawardi. I mean,
Oh, is it Abdul Hamid al-Katib?
that's Mawardi.
لا رسالة الصحابة.
رسالة الصحابة. That's Ibn
Yeah.
Qafa.
Yeah, no, that's what I meant. I mean, because it's a similar kind of text. It's about, no, but it's about the polity and the rule. Of the,
Yeah, that's written. That's written for the not for Al Mansur or for Safah.
Yeah, I was just wondering to what extent it shows a rupture or shows a continuity with the continuity from Umayyad to Abbasid rule. It's an interesting text to have been written so soon in the Abbasid period.
I'll answer your question very narrowly to keep it brief, which is it can be adduced. In fact, it is adduced in conventional argumentation for the elaboration of that conception of God's caliph. So, I mean, it takes a radical. It prescribes a very radical absolutism that the Abbasids did not embrace.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for that answer, and thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.